Okay, welcome to the people who are joining. I'm going to start fairly promptly, actually. Or am I? So, there we go. So, welcome to those joining. My name's Louise Edgington. I'm an educational psychologist within Westminster, Kensington and Chelsea. And I have a side interest that is sort of growing and growing in climate change psychology. And that's really come about through initially doing a physics degree and looking at climate physics and doing a bit of internships for things like Bloomberg New Energy Finance. And then I taught a bit of it, and I always thought I was going to go into that field, but became a psychologist, and things have come full circle now that this is such a pressing issue for, the whole of humanity, and also for the children that we seek to support in our work in schools. So today we're going to be looking at eco-emotions and eco-anxiety, and there's another webinar scheduled for 2 weeks' time where we're going to look at the side of climate change that's more related to sort of education and supporting resilience and almost like future-proofing children. Not that that's possible, but just thinking more about education in general. But today is about the sort of emotional side of climate and things that brings up for us. So, as I mentioned, I have a sort of physicsy background, but my credentials, as it were, in this line of work is really that about 3 years ago in my service, I set up a working group, and we've been meeting, 3.5 years now, we've been meeting regularly to just discuss this, and we've developed a suite of resources that we give out to schools. We do training to parents and children and other professionals, and do sort of insets like this as well. I also have a consultant role with a group called the Climate Psychologists, working on their climate education programme, which has more of an international bent to it through the Council of International Schools. And recently, excitingly, the BPS has just formed a Climate and Action Environment Coordinating Group to try and think of what our role as psychologists, all different types of psychologists, needs to be in this zone going forward. So that's where I'm coming from, and I won't necessarily be able to answer all the questions. I'm by no means an expert in this field. This is such a nascent field in the first place that I'm just finding my way as well. But I'm going to share some of the things that we might do in our trainings to school, and it's sort of it's a mashup of different approaches. I haven't tailored it to children or parents or EPs. It's like an overview of what we might do. And so in all of this, and this is what we'd say when we deliver the training to schools, the oxygen mask principle, everything I'm going to talk about today, yes, it's relevant for us supporting children who might be experiencing eco-anxiety, but it absolutely applies to us first. We can't support young people to work through difficult feelings if we're dysregulated ourselves. So perhaps as you're going through this, see how it applies to you, and really question that first before we try and apply it to children. Okay, so we're going to look at eco-emotions, what that is. Look at psychological defenses and ignoring, which is basically another form of denial nowadays. And I really want to spend most of the session on eco-anxiety and self-care, so the kind of strategies and things that we can be suggesting as EPs for schools to be looking at. So this is certainly how I conceptualize the balance, getting the balance right between, on the left here, having our heads in the sand, and that might not be necessarily full-on denial of climate change. It doesn't exist, but just carrying on as if nothing needs to change, having our head in the sand. That state of being is where a lot of people are a lot of the time, but any of you who are here today, congratulations, that is taking a step to get your head out of the sand, so I thank you for that. The risk and the reason why we keep our head in the sand is that to look up and actually face the possibilities of what could happen if we don't address climate change is pretty overwhelming, and it can cause eco-anxiety and all sorts of other feelings around that. So during the course of today, this session rather, you might just want to think about these two ends of a scale and maybe give yourself a little rating about where you are in any given moment, because we're aiming for balance, we're aiming for that awareness without getting totally freaked out and, you know, activating our fight or flight response. So just a little word on eco-anxiety before I expand that term into the broader gamut of eco-emotions that can exist. You know, eco-anxiety was the word that sort of, I'd say, emerged first to describe people who might be struggling with different feelings around climate change. It's important to note it's not considered a sort of pathological or maladaptive condition. It's not in the DSM-5. It is considered a very natural and normal response to what's going on. And if you're interested, there are scales out there that attempt to measure this. I've put in the probably the most popular one down there. There are others, but as you can imagine, they're, you know, as with any scale, they're not perfect. So, as I mentioned, there are a whole host now of different words that have been coined to try and capture the broad range of emotions that people or children may be feeling. Rather than run through them all, I'm actually going to be quiet for a couple of moments and invite you to scribble down numbers 1 to 7 on a piece of paper or in the chat. And we're going to see if you can link them up to the letter that defines the term. So the first one, for example, I'll do for you is 1F, Tierra trauma, deep emotional trauma from experiencing environmental disaster. In the UK, many of us are fortunate that we haven't experienced the worst of direct impacts, but many people around the globe have. So I'll just be quiet for maybe even a minute just to give people a chance to have a go at this. Feel free to put your answers in the chat if you're keen. Okay. Conscious that that may have not been enough time for everybody, but here are the answers. Tierra trauma, eco-anxiety, 2G, chronic fear of environmental doom. Solasthesia, that sense of loss of one's habitat, even though it's still here. Homesickness when at home. Eco-guilt, Tierra fury, that anger. Metero-anxiety and eco-paralysis. Now, I'm not suggesting that these words will necessarily come up a lot in work in schools, but I think it's important at the very least to acknowledge that they are increasingly going to creep into our lexicon and our sort of general awareness, really. And I think it can be helpful to introduce conversations around, you know, the different range of emotions that can exist in this realm. And these are the definitions as they are. Another thing you might just like to ask yourself, looking at the list, is how many of them have you personally experienced? Have you had some in the past and you no longer have them? This sense of being able to show awareness and articulate and model the ability to actually lean into this stuff and articulate it, I think is really important if we're going to literally demonstrate to children that we can talk about this and handle it together. Okay, so thinking back then to this notion of what we're aiming for when we're trying to process feelings around climate is, yes, it's important to have the language to do that, but as I said, it's about this balance between head in the sand versus overwhelm. So we're going to spend most of the session looking at strategies to combat eco-anxiety or other feelings and overwhelm, but I'd like to just take a moment now to look at the ignoring and defenses part. Things that as psychologists, it's important that we are aware of, because really the reason the climate crisis has got to the situation it is our inability to look at the reality of what's happening. It's our sort of fear holding us back. And there is a lot of psychology out there that describes this. Gifford's dragons down at the bottom here, 33 psychological biases and barriers that limit climate action. That's a nice resource that you could delve into if you're interested. One that's quite good for children and schools and that we use at the climate psychologist team is Per Espen-Stokes' 5 defenses model. There's a nice TED talk that explains these things. For example, the first one, distance, this sense that climate change can be happening far away, or either geographically it's happening far away or far away in time. Some people might perceive it that way. And the nice thing is that he has 5 S's here, which is his attempt to flip them into supportive solutions. My top 3 psychological defenses, and I've probably experienced these myself in the past, is bystander effect, this notion that we tend to think the governments will sort it or technology will sort it. It's not my problem. In reality, it's everyone's problem. It's our collective responsibility. The sunk cost fallacy, this absolutely is relevant to people. Not everybody can afford to make some of the necessary changes in their lives, or this sense, if we've got gas heating in our home, that's an investment and it simply costs too much to change it, even though, the cost of not making changes in the long run is far worse. And the other one that's really good to be aware of is the social comparison effect, this notion that we tend to be very much influenced by what we see people doing around us. So if you are if everyone in your family is a rabid meat eater, sorry, that's probably not a very fair adjective, keen meat eater, then you're unlikely to think there's anything needing to change there. Or likewise, if your friend group takes weekend breaks to Ibiza in the summer, you might not think there's anything wrong with that either. Okay, so psychological defenses. If we do end up talking about these, it's not to shame anyone around it. We all have these within us. As humans, we don't think rationally, and so we need to be able to talk about what might be holding us back. And these are some ideas to get you started. Okay, but moving on really to the self-care tips. What can we do when we're in the overwhelmed state to not be there, to get more balanced. And I've got these in 4 different categories. Again, very much it applies to us as supporting adults to be applying these in our own life, and then adapting it for use with children as well. So the categories that I'll run through now one by one are flare-ups, when things are really bad in the moment, things we can do to prevent getting these sort of, bursts of dread or fear or whatever it might be, thinking about thinking traps, and lastly, fostering hope and agency. So flare-ups, as psychologists, a lot of you will be familiar with this, really. It's the sense of when we're triggered into that fight or flight or freeze response, our nervous system, the first thing we need to do is to regulate, is to calm that down. So a lot of the strategies that we suggest here are things that would apply in other scenarios. But before we run through the calming, grounding activities, and that can be, the finger breathing, naming 5 things you can see, feel, hear, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, tapping. Some people might find it a bit out there, but that's another one. Also, other meditation, progressive muscle relaxation, breathing techniques, any of that calms the nervous system is good. But really, the piece that's particular to climate is that before we do that, there needs to be some sort of acknowledgement that actually it's okay to calm yourself down. This, even though, the brain might be saying, no, but it's a real threat. If we're in this state of hyperarousal, then we're no good to anyone, in a sense. You can't make positive change and or be helpful, really. So it's this self-talk of trusting yourself to make the right decisions when you're calm, you're safe in this very moment, you're safe. And also a bit of self-compassion that, feel it's understandable to feel anxious about this, but it's okay to get grounded and calm. The second category of eco-anxiety strategy is around sort of general day-to-day things you can be doing to prevent these flare-ups of sort of fear occurring. Limiting the news and looking for positive, balancing news is super important. I subscribe to a couple of, I subscribe to one clean energy newsletter and another sort of climate good news newsletter. One's called Cypher, one's called Nexus Energy. And it just kind of balances some of the more negative stuff. And I also do limit myself to general news consumption for reasons that I'm sure you'll all understand. 5 Ways to Wellbeing is just a very general but super helpful way to make sure that we are taking care of ourselves day to day and in generally good mental health. Sitting with your feelings. Now this, it sounds rather trite, but has for me actually been probably the key part to all of this. Rather than trying to push those difficult feelings away and end up with your head in the sand, actually giving yourself time and space to feel the feelings. And some people like to do that through meditations, walks in nature. Just acknowledge what's going on rather than being scared of it, I think is really important. And children, I think, will need guiding and teaching how to do this. Another thing that the climate psychologists talk about is thanking our eco-emotions for showing us what we value. And actually, it can really bring a sense of perspective into things. So I think that's quite a nice approach. And finally, the perspective piece, linked to the thank you piece. This can be really important, especially for people who are involved in activism. there can be this tendency to want to save the world, but actually understanding that, our efforts are a part of the bigger collective effort, and that even if it might feel like we're not making a difference, every little conversation you have, every little action makes a difference, and that may, through the process of social comparison, that may influence somebody else. And, we are in this transition period where there's a sort of collective turning, and it's happening, and it might take time, and we never quite know. This good luck, bad luck, who knows? We never quite know how things are going to turn out. So if we're just responsible for our own actions and moving in the right direction, then we are doing enough. The third category of self-care tip is around thinking traps. Now, this has a sort of CBT feel to it. And yet I really want to emphasize that we are not for 1 minute here suggesting that there are faulty cognitions occurring. There's nothing, well, as I've said before, there's nothing maladaptive in experiencing eco-anxiety. It is a threat. Climate change is probably it is the biggest threat to humanity. But there are some cognitive thinking errors, I suppose, that might make the anxiety worse than it needs to be. So I'll just run through some of these now. So there's a piece of research that identified something called the myth of self-interest. The reference down at the bottom there that says we tend to overestimate selfish behavior in others. So sometimes I'm like, oh, nobody's ever going to change, or people only care about their own interests. That's not necessarily true. And that thought might make our anxiety, thinking other people are selfish, might make things seem or feel worse than they need to be. Emotional reasoning, a CBT term, just because we have that sense of fear or hopelessness, that can lead people to assume there is something to be feared or something hopeless about the situation. Again, it's distinguishing, there's no truth in my feelings, it's just a feeling. It comes and it goes, it doesn't predict the future. Black and white thinking, and actually this kind of links to fatalism. Governments are doing nothing, it's all hopeless. Again, those thoughts is the human brain's way of sort of being lazy, essentially. It's easier to say it's all this or it's all that, rather than consider the nuance and complexity of the actual situation. And there is nothing more complex than the problem of climate change, because it encompasses everything. It's been described as a hyper object because it literally encompasses all geographies and peoples and economies and psychologies, and it's a lot. So it's natural for us to just fling out statements like government's doing nothing. But it's not true. And that's, as I said, is linked to fatalism. Spreading sort of messages of doom or things are hopeless can cause, I say it's contagious, it can cause people to feel hopeless themselves and give up. And in that sense, it can be unhelpful, I would say. So it's important to avoid that, especially when talking to children. Okay, another point about resilience to uncertainty. Maybe this should be in the preventative section, actually, but as a society, we don't like uncertainty. We organize our lives around avoiding it. We have insurance, we plan our diaries, everything, our whole society is structured to avoid uncertainty, but actually we are entering a period of intense, crazy uncertainty, especially when you throw AI into the mix. we just don't know how things are going to turn out. And the more we can model being okay with that, giving up control, the more our children are going to be okay with it too. And there's a link down there to some Anxiety Canada resources, which suggest cool things to actively build up your tolerance to uncertainties, you know, such as start small, let someone else choose the program on telly, or order something random from a menu. Okay, and the last suggestion of the way we can just tweak our thinking slightly, as Brené Brown's foreboding joy notion that many people might have a sort of hypervigilance to their day-to-day life, always looking out for the threat, always feeling that they can't quite relax or enjoy themselves. And actually, again, I don't think that's helpful or necessary. Yes, we need to take our head out the sands and take action, but it's okay to enjoy our lives. In fact, it's super important. Okay, and I've been aiming for past, so I'll look at this final eco-anxiety self-care tip, which is probably the most important, and it's around fostering hope and agency. It's been said that taking action on climate change is the best antidote to eco-anxiety. That sense of, I can make a difference here, really helps. So the one thing to bear in mind when we're taking action is not just to take it and forget about it, but actually to notice it and talk about it and celebrate it, because otherwise we can be doing all sorts of great things, but if we're still only focusing on the problem and, you know, the rate of glaciers melting or whatever it is, that's not going to be very motivating at all. So we need to attend to progress and attend to positive news as well. For example, you know, looking at other successes of societal change, such as the ozone layer. I find that quite inspiring. Those of you that don't know, the ozone layer is closing, if not closed. Another real motivator, I think, is the flip side of social comparison. Yes, we can be influenced negatively by each other, but we can also be influenced really positively by each other. Individual solutions build bottom-up support for policies and big business. So that sense of, oh, it's the government's job or it's the corporation's job, what can I do? The governments and corporations are motivated, and their rationale is driven by the people. So we absolutely do have power to change things through the power of conversations, through the power of social comparison and collective action. And finally, and maybe this should have been first, activating, just doing something. It makes you feel better and it helps, and other people see it, and it makes a difference. So I try and do one thing each week to reduce my carbon footprint, and it's just a ongoing thing. I don't try and do everything perfectly, nor do I shame other people into not doing things perfectly. But just doing what you can each week, or just, you know, constantly trying to trim or tweak things here and there, I think is important. Activating others. People want to do this to varying degrees. You can sign petitions, you can apply it to your work. So me here today and this whole working group is me activating others. This is my form of activism. You know, going and getting involved in something like XR isn't for me, but this is how I choose to be active in this zone. And everybody's going to have their own skill set or situation. So it's going to look different for you, however you are. But in a gentle, kind, supportive way, I think it is important just to be having conversations like this. Okay, and so at 2 minutes over, I will just maybe suggest if anyone wants to take a moment to think about what from those 4 eco-anxiety tips and suggestions, what's really resonated with you from the 4 different categories, and what might you try and implement in your daily life going forward? So feel free to share that, or I'll jump to the questions. Otherwise, we'll leave it there. Let me have a look. Thank you, Sarah, for all of these links in the chat. I haven't been seeing them as we've been going along, but that's super helpful. Awful. Thank you. Thank you. So I'm not sure if I'm looking in the wrong place, but if there are any questions, feel free to jump in. Or if I've rattled through and some part of it wasn't perfectly clear, feel free to quiz me on that as well. No, and if there are no questions, then we can just wrap up here. Okay. Thank you, everybody.